He spent only a small part of his reign in England, yet he became one of its greatest legends. Feared by enemies, admired by allies, and remembered as the Lionheart, Richard I became the embodiment of the medieval warrior king. He rode under the cross during the Third Crusade, challenged Saladin in the Holy Land, captured cities, won battles, and inspired stories that survived for centuries. But behind the legend was a complicated ruler. Richard was courageous, disciplined, and brilliant in battle, but his wars demanded money, men, and sacrifice from the kingdoms he ruled. He was a king of England, Duke of Normandy, Duke of Aquitaine, and Count of Anjou, but he often seemed more at home in a campaign tent than in a royal court. His fame was built with swords, ships, sieges, and impossible marches. His enemies learned to respect his speed and aggression. His supporters saw in him the perfect crusading knight. But did Richard truly deserve his legendary reputation? Or did the myth of the Lionheart grow larger than the man himself? This is the story of Richard the Lionheart, England's warrior king. Across Europe and the Middle East, his name became tied to courage, crusading zeal, and royal ambition. This episode asks what made Richard so effective, what made him so expensive, and why a king who barely governed England directly became one of the most recognizable figures in English history. Richard was born in 1157. The son of King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and remarkable women of the Middle Ages. He was born into the Angevin Empire, a vast collection of territories that stretched from England across much of western France. It was not a modern nation-state, but a family empire held together by inheritance, loyalty, marriage, and force. Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Aquitaine, and England all formed part of the political world Richard inherited. Castles guarded roads and river crossings. Dukes, counts, bishops, and rebellious nobles watched the royal family for weakness. Richard grew up in this dangerous world, especially in Aquitaine, where aristocratic culture celebrated poetry, honor, and war. His family was powerful, but deeply divided. Henry II was a masterful ruler, but his sons resented his control. Eleanor had her own authority and ambitions. Before Richard became king, he had already learned that power was often won through conflict, even inside his own family. The Angevin world made him wealthy. It also made him dangerous. The map of his inheritance explains much of his life. Richard was not simply an English king waiting for a throne. He was a continental prince whose heart, language, culture, and wars were deeply connected to France. The Angevin Empire gave him opportunity, but it also guaranteed conflict with rival kings and rebellious vassals. Richard became a prince of war long before he became a king. Raised largely in Aquitaine, he learned to command knights, negotiate with nobles, and suppress rebellion in a region where authority was constantly tested. By his teenage years, he was already involved in campaigns and sieges. Chroniclers described him as tall, forceful, and intensely energetic, a ruler who preferred action to hesitation. His reputation for courage grew quickly, but so did his reputation for severity. Richard understood that castles were the keys to power. If a fortress resisted, he moved against it with determination. If a noble rebelled, he answered with force. One of the most striking facts of his youth is that Richard fought against his own father during rebellions led by Henry's sons. The royal family that ruled half of France and all of England was also a battlefield of ambition. These conflicts trained Richard in the harsh realities of medieval politics. He learned that loyalty could shift, that brothers could become rivals, and that a crown was never secure unless it was defended. The Lionheart was forged before he ever wore the crown. This early career also shaped his style of command. Richard valued speed, personal bravery, and direct pressure. He could inspire troops because he shared danger with them, but he could also be unforgiving when authority was challenged. In the brutal politics of the 12th century, those qualities made him both admired and feared.
In 1189, Henry II died, exhausted by war and betrayal. Richard became King of England, but almost immediately his attention turned east. Jerusalem had fallen to Saladin 2 years earlier, and Europe was preparing for the Third Crusade. Richard committed himself completely. The message of his reign could be summarized in one phrase: everything for the crusade. To finance the expedition, he raised taxes, sold offices, sold rights, and even released King William of Scotland from obligations in exchange for money. Richard is said to have joked that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. Whether exaggerated or not, the story captures the scale of his determination. He gathered ships, knights, infantry, supplies, and treasure for a campaign across the Mediterranean. In England, some saw holy purpose. Others felt the cost. Richard's kingship began not with years of domestic government, but with mobilization for war. He would leave behind officials to manage the kingdom while he pursued glory in the East. Preparing for the crusade also revealed Richard's priorities. He saw the recovery of the Holy Land as a sacred duty and a chance to win immortal fame. The machinery of government became, for him, a way to fund movement, ships, weapons, and soldiers. The crown was a platform for crusading kingship.
The Third Crusade began as a journey across a dangerous sea of politics and storms. Richard traveled through Sicily, where disputes over inheritance and alliances delayed the Crusaders, but also showed his willingness to use force when challenged. Then came Cyprus. In 1191, after shipwrecks and conflict with the island's ruler, Richard captured Cyprus. This was more than a side adventure. Cyprus became an important supply base for the Crusaders, controlling routes between the eastern Mediterranean and the Holy Land. It offered harbors, food, and strategic depth, and it remained under Crusader control for nearly 3 centuries. From Cyprus, Richard continued toward the Siege of Acre, one of the central struggles of the Crusade. Acre had already been under siege for nearly 2 years. The camps were exhausted, disease was common, and Saladin's forces tried to relieve the city from outside. When Richard arrived, he brought fresh energy, resources, and military expertise. The Lionheart had reached the battlefield where his legend would truly begin. The capture of Cyprus also showed Richard's strategic instincts. He did not treat logistics as an afterthought. A crusading army needed safe ports, water, repairs, and supply lines. By taking the island, Richard turned a crisis into an advantage and strengthened the Crusader position before reaching the main theater of war.
The Siege of Acre was brutal, complex, and exhausting. Crusader forces surrounded the city while Saladin's army pressed them from the outside, creating a deadly struggle between walls and field armies. Siege engines battered towers, miners attacked foundations, disease and hunger moved through camps on both sides. Richard's arrival helped transform the siege.
Even while ill, he directed operations, encouraged assaults, and brought pressure against the defenders. In July 1191, Acre surrendered. It was a major victory for the Third Crusade and a powerful demonstration of Richard's leadership. But Acre also revealed the darker side of crusading warfare. After failed negotiations over prisoner exchanges and other terms, thousands of Muslim prisoners were killed on Richard's orders. The episode remains one of the most controversial moments of the crusade. To Richard's supporters, it was a harsh decision in a brutal war. To critics, it was ruthless and unforgivable. The Lionheart's legend cannot be told honestly without this shadow. Acre gave Richard glory, but it also left a stain. Acre became a test of endurance as much as command. Victory required engineering, diplomacy, money, and the ability to keep exhausted soldiers focused. Richard's presence did not solve every problem, but it gave the Crusader army a center of gravity. After Acre, every commander in the region had to measure himself against him.
After Acre, Richard marched south along the coast toward Jaffa. Saladin knew that the Crusader army was dangerous, but he also knew it could be worn down. His cavalry harassed the column again and again, striking the flanks, firing arrows, and trying to provoke a reckless charge. Richard's answer was discipline. He kept his infantry, crossbowmen, and knights in tight order, protecting the baggage and refusing to break formation too early. The pressure reached its peak near Arsuf in September 1191. For hours, Saladin's forces attacked. The Crusaders endured. Then, at the right moment, Richard unleashed a counterattack. The charge of the knights hit with devastating force, and Saladin's army withdrew. The Battle of Arsuf was a clear Crusader victory. It restored morale after years of setbacks and proved that Saladin could be beaten in open battle. Yet it did not destroy Saladin's power. Richard had won a brilliant tactical success, but the larger war remained unresolved. Arsuf showed why he was feared. Patience under pressure, then sudden violence at exactly the right time. Arsuf became the battle that best displayed Richard's military talent. He did not let anger or pressure control the timing of his attack. He waited until the enemy was committed, then turned defense into offense. It was the kind of moment that creates legends, because thousands of men saw discipline become victory before their eyes.
The rivalry between Richard and Saladin became one of the most famous contests of the medieval world. Each man recognized the danger of the other. Richard won battles and seized coastal positions, but Saladin protected the interior and refused to risk everything in a single disastrous engagement. Jerusalem stood at the heart of the campaign. Richard considered advancing on the city more than once, but the decision was never simple. Capturing Jerusalem was one challenge. Holding it against counterattack was another. Supply lines were long, the weather could turn, and political divisions inside the Crusader camp weakened resolve. Richard understood that a heroic assault might become a strategic trap. Saladin understood that delay could be a weapon. Negotiations moved alongside military operations. Envoys traveled between camps, terms were discussed, and both sides searched for an ending that preserved honor. Sometimes knowing when not to fight is as important as winning battles. In 1192, the Treaty of Jaffa ended the campaign. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims were permitted to visit safely. Neither side achieved complete victory. The treaty showed the limits of medieval power. Even two great commanders could not force events to obey them. Disease, distance, supply, rival nobles, and exhausted soldiers all mattered. Richard's reputation grew because he fought Saladin hard, but his judgment also mattered because he knew the price of overreach. Richard's troubles did not end when he left the Holy Land. Returning through Europe in disguise, he was captured near Vienna by Duke Leopold of Austria, a former crusading ally whose quarrel with Richard had begun during the campaign. Richard was later handed to Emperor Henry VI. The warrior king became a prisoner, and his freedom came at a staggering price: 150,000 marks, one of the largest ransoms in medieval history. England and the Angevin lands were forced to raise an enormous sum through taxes, payments, and the seizure of wealth. The burden was felt across the kingdom. When Richard was released in 1194, he returned not to peace, but to war in France. His rival Philip II had used Richard's absence to attack Angevin lands, and Richard spent his final years fighting to recover and defend them. In 1199, during the Siege of Chalice, he was struck by a crossbow bolt. The wound worsened, likely through infection, and Richard died days later. He was only 41 years old. The ransom turned Richard's legend into a financial crisis. Songs and stories celebrated the captive king, but officials at home had to collect the money. His return brought relief and spectacle, yet it also reminded the kingdom that crusading glory could become a burden measured in silver. Richard's legacy is a battle between history and legend. He was one of medieval Europe's greatest battlefield commanders, bold, disciplined, charismatic, and tactically gifted. His nickname, Lionheart, became one of history's most famous royal titles. Yet he spent little time in England and is remembered more as a crusader and warrior than as an administrator. His reign placed heavy financial demands on his kingdom, first for the crusade and then for his ransom and wars in France. Over the centuries, literature transformed him into a symbol of knightly courage, often placing him beside Robin Hood and other legends of medieval England. The real Richard was more complicated, brave but costly, inspiring but severe, brilliant in war but distant from daily government. He became a legend through courage, determination, and battlefield brilliance. Yet his story reminds us that greatness often comes at a cost, not only to enemies, but also to the kingdoms left behind. Next time, we turn to Joan of Arc, France's teenage champion. That contradiction is why Richard remains fascinating. He was not the model of a peaceful administrator, but as a symbol of martial kingship, he was unmatched. His life closes this chapter of our champions with a question that will follow the series. Is greatness measured by what a leader wins, or by what those victories cost?